A little vote, please. Who do you think is the most hated man in Canada? Robert Milton or Michael Bate? Can we have a vote? Anybody who's ever been in the pages of Frank knows that it's a scurrilous rag, that it's run by malicious thugs who make an unholy profit from insulting, demeaning, and otherwise humiliating people in power, the rich, the famous. But it's interesting that they're perfectly prepared to believe everything that's written about everybody else, especially if it's a friend. Michael Bate, where are you? I think it takes a lot of courage to show your face.
I have a few headlines, Moses. I brought along the official Frank redress application form. So if anybody here, we've called him a bingo caller or an avid pianist or a gormless archdeacon, anything along those lines, then please fill out this form after the presentation, and I'll make sure there's an apology jammed into Frank next issue. We like to give apologies because they're free. It's cheaper than libel suits, as we've discovered. See, there's not a lot of friends out here. I think I'll. Here's what Soren Kierkegaard said of journalists. The lowest depth to which people can sink before God is defined by the word journalist. If I had a son who became a journalist and continued to be one for 5 years, I would give him up. I think it's a bit gloomy even for Kierkegaard, the old dark Dane. But I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that journalists have long been held low in public esteem. And if anything, that low opinion has sunk even lower in recent years. Last year in the United States, a Pew Research poll showed that 38% agree with the notion that newspapers hurt democracy. And surveys and focus groups that we've all read characterize the news media as arrogant, inaccurate, superficial, that sort of thing, sensational, biased. And that's not good because probably the only thing that ensures the survival of free and unbiased reporting is free and unbiased journalism. And I think there are several reasons for the decline in newspaper credibility. One of them is the agenda-driven media, which we're all familiar with if we read the National Post. You know, AJ, I understand they're a sponsor here, are they? Is that true? Okay. Excuse me. As AJ Liebling put it, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. I think that the principal failure of the Post has been the political agenda of its proprietor, Tubby Black. And I think that this is an important factor in credibility. Newspapers should be seen to be objective. And of course, it's no secret that Mr. Black is an ultra-conservative, pro-business, pro-American. He has hired reporters to give a right-wing slant to the news. Anybody who read the Post coverage on the Calgary Herald strike would appreciate that one. His paper is rife with conservative columnists. He claims that he's merely compensating for the soft left-wing pap of the other newspapers in Canada. Of course, this is classic Black, the bully boy strategy. You attack the competition, the lazy, pinko, alcoholic hacks of the other guys, and then in order to defend your own practices and your own philosophy. But here's the problem with the Post and its agenda. Canadians don't want to be harangued by Mr. Black. We don't want to be hectored and nagged every day about free trade. You read the Post and you feel like you're being yelled at on the parade ground. It's not the craft of journalism, it's propaganda. And I think it hurts the credibility of what is otherwise a very good newspaper. You look at the front page and you can guarantee the front page is going to be brain drain, tax cuts, or Canadian dollars. I think it's small wonder that Mr. Black is now in retreat, having discovered too late that Canadians won't buy a refried, reheated Daily Telegraph. Here's another area that I think that journalism is under fire, and that's convergence, which is the buzzword of the year, synergy and convergence. And we have CanWest Global is fused with Southern and with National Post. We have BCE and CTV with the Globe and Mail. So now we have this vast array of choice at our fingertips. We can cyber surf between movies and news and email, and we can browse articles on Saturday night or watch Bugs Bunny. But when you give it a closer look, isn't this convergence business just good old-fashioned cross-promotion? The National Post blows Global TV and vice versa. It's a mutual reinforcement, and I wonder where the craft of journalism fits in a world where newspapers, magazines, television news, and cartoon characters are all part of the same gigantic corporation. Now, we know that for a long time, advertisers have tried to wield their economic muscle. You look at back in 1935, there was medical evidence about the dangers of smoking, but it was suppressed for decades in the mainstream media because the tobacco companies were the biggest advertisers in the newspaper business. But I think with convergence, reporters have to step carefully, not only about offending some of the local advertisers, but they have to be aware also of the whole range of corporations, including the one that owns the newspaper or the network or the TV station they work for. You think about 90% of the newspapers in this country are run by three people, three champions of free speech. Izzy Asper, who's a key liberal bagman, and Brian Mulrooney, who's the head of Sun Media, and Conrad Black. So you can see that the media corporations have grown and become tighter with government and have a greater political influence that is much more decisive. Have this water? I hope so. Nothing
Doctored by some of your subjects.
So what we see in the midst of the newspaper war is a relentless push of publishers to make certain that their editors are on side with the business objectives. In the past, there's been more of a separation of church and state. The publisher was responsible for reconciling the competing demands of editorial management and business management. Now the editors have made part of the whole process. I mean, I find it extraordinary that the publisher of the Globe and Mail, Philip Crawley, reviews every story that has to do with the Globe. He literally dictates to the Globe media reporter the stories about the Globe and its glorious triumphs in the newspaper war. I think it's the first in Globe history, and it seems a dangerous precedent. But it's also dangerous, so is self-censorship. You know, Conrad Black has always maintained that he does not dictate what is printed in his papers. But of course, he doesn't have to. It isn't necessary for the boss to interfere. The culture of the newsroom is, in this corporate system, requires you to learn the ropes. You learn what to do and what not to do. You've got to make a living. I think another reason why there's such distrust of newspapers and journalists is that too often reporters don't behave like reporters. They're too anxious to be part of the system. But it seems to me that a good reporter is an outsider, is always an outsider, an observer. He's a chronicler, or she is a chronicler looking in. But for many reporters, I think the craft of journalism is defined by how close they can get to power. You don't find many more pampered and pompous groups of individuals in Canada than the National Press Corps in Ottawa. They pontificate and they preen, and they like to think they lay down the political agenda for the nation. And some in the gallery, in the press gallery, are vain or stupid enough to believe that the politicians actually like them for who they are. Let me give you a personal example. We've had our share of lawsuits at Frank over the years. You know it's a bad day when you get a lawyer's letter from your own lawyer. One of the most notorious was the $600,000 suit for libel and defamation by Mike Duffy, the Parliament Hill pundit for CTV. Now, if you think it's a bit bizarre that journalists are suing journalists, I should mention that over half of our lawsuits have come from media personalities. Stephen Brill of Brill's Content magazine once said that when it comes to power and arrogance and the lack of accountability and being challenged, journalists make lawyers look good. And Edward R. Murrow has done my favorite is that journalists don't have thin skins, they have no skins. Anyway, getting back to Mr. Duffy. In 1995, we wrote a story that was headlined, "Mike Duffy, Fat-Faced Liar." I think we were wrong on only one count there, maybe. It was a story about Mr. Duffy claiming he was at a Canadian Studies seminar at Duke University, when in fact he was attending the Duke Fat Farm, or the Diet Spa, whatever they call it. Now, the facts of our story weren't in dispute, but we still spent 3 years and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees quibbling over whether or not stretching the truth makes someone a liar. Was Duffy a liar or simply an evasive dieter? We still don't know, because at the end of the day, Mr. Duffy spent nearly $70,000 in legal fees. We spent about $35,000, and the case never got to court. We finally settled out of court, gave him $30,000 to go away because we had another very large debt we had to pay, a judge. Don't ever get involved with a judge, especially one in Quebec. Don't get sued by a judge in Quebec. So Mr. Duffy spent $70,000 to make $30,000, so he was out $40,000, and he claimed victory. But I learned a couple of important facts here. One is that the libel laws in Canada are there to protect the wealthy from their critics. When you get sued, you're like some character out of Kafka. You're guilty of something, and it's something for which damages are presumed, or the person wouldn't have sued you in the first place, right? So now you have to prove your innocence before you go slowly broke. Now, under Canadian libel law, all the plaintiff needs to kick off a libel suit is to be offended and wealthy. No need to show that a writer got any fact wrong or did any tangible damage just to get the whole legal show on the road. That's libel. And I also learned that the craft of journalism means something different to different people. It turned out that Mr. Duffy's libel suit wasn't so much about defamation or his journalistic integrity being smeared. It was about vanity and his desire for awards and honorifics so he could be part of the power elite. I have some passages here from Mr. Duffy's examination for discovery, which was held in June 1997. And Mr. Duffy testified under oath that he had been nominated for the Order of Canada 3 times, and 3 times he had been spurned. And it was the fault of us. It was the fault of Frank magazine that he didn't get it. Now, how did Mr. Duffy know that he had lost out in the Order of Canada? I mean, it's supposed to be a secret process. The Privy Council and the Rideau Hall, there's a committee for the Order of Canada. Well, according to Duffy, the source of the information was none other than Prime Minister Chrétien. According to Duffy, Chrétien said the Order of Canada committee didn't want the order to be brought into disrepute by being associated with Frank. And Duffy testified, and I quote here, "So my mother gets to go to her grave without seeing her son get an award that Joe Schlesinger got, that Peter Zosky got, but because of Frank, I don't get. That makes my blood boil." As a journalist, you cannot allow yourself to be seduced by power. To be a good reporter, I think you have to know what side you're on going in, like I.F. Stone or Hunter Thompson. Are you someone who aspires to power, or are you actually a reporter whose goal is to come as close as possible to exposing the truth about power and ambition and influence as you can? Adrian Clarkson, a journalist, becomes Governor General. Alan Fotheringham belongs to clubs. I mean, what could be more contradictory? Journalists belonging to a club. To me, it's selling out. It's selling off the right of journalists to torment the powerful. It debases the currency of journalism. What's the deal with journalists like Rex Murphy or Michael Valpy or Dalton Camp running for political office? They're journalists, or aren't they? If journalists don't stay on the outside and expose the powerful, we get Chomsky's manufacturing of consent, the publishing of news that serves the interests of the equestrian class. Well, sometimes at Frank or in the alternative, the satirical press, we feel like Irish monks during the Dark Ages. We're struggling to keep a grand notion like literacy alive until the larger society can be entrusted with it. But most of the time we just feel like Irish monks, chilly and unappealing to women. So. In the meantime, thank God for the preposterous poseurs who would manipulate our brains for their own gain. So long live Lord Tubby, and long live Byron Muldoon, and vive Mike Duffy. So without them, Frank would be out of business. Thank you.